Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here super early. I understand last night was an exciting night, so we're flattered. I'm the moderator. I'm Tasha. I'm a reporter at FedScoop. I'm going to just guide us very quickly through this beginning portion, introducing my panelists, getting a little bit of a sense for who you are, so get ready for that question. And then we're going to kick this off. How this panel is going to go is each panelist is going to give about a 5-minute overview of the work that they do in the identity space in government, and then we're going to convene back together and have like a whole discussion on some of the overlap areas. So moving down the panel from me, we have David Bao, who's the Deputy Executive Director of the U.S. Digital Service at the Department of Veterans Affairs. We have Blake Hall, who's the CEO of ID.me, and Paul Wight, who's the Associate Director of Identity Assurance at the IRS. Now that you know who we are, we would love to know a little bit of who you are. So who here works for an identity solution provider company? Okay, and who works for a company that buys identity solutions in the private sector? And who's in government? All right.
Cool.
Good government showing. Awesome. Cool, thank you so much. So now I believe it's Blake first who's going to kick us off with our 5 minutes. So there we go.
All right, thank you very much. So just wanted to start off by setting some context. The number of logins and passwords continues to proliferate as more services come online and the digital economy grows. And so some stats from the password managers that have the best statistics on how many different logins they're managing for some of their users show that the average American has over 200 different accounts that require passwords, and that number is projected to double over the next 5 years. So it's a pretty staggering number. And then if you look at some of the Pew research on how people manage their passwords, 86% of Americans report using their memory. Well, pretty hard to remember 400 unique, strong passwords. And so it's no wonder that, if you look at how enterprises are being breached, whether it was the OPM breach for an administrator or Anthem Healthcare, breach credentials account for over 80% of enterprise breaches. And that's just because we've created a system where even the smartest human being is not capable of deploying appropriate security practices. So we're really passionate about changing that aspect of identity. In many ways, Estonia is the digital leader when it comes to identity, and they have a mantra that says, never make the same user do the same thing twice. And we're really passionate about shared services that also never make the same person do the same thing twice. And it's not just passwords, it's everything that go into identity workflows. If you visited the doctor recently and you filled out that damn clipboard with all your family medical history, then you've probably done that more than once. So there are countries that have shown a better model. And if you go to the next slide, the way that we frame the problem for the United States anyway is a 2x2 where you've got portability on the y-axis and you've got trust on the x-axis. Our most portable logins are provided by advertising companies, Facebook, Connect, Google, but they're not trusted. You wouldn't think of using Facebook to log into your medical information. If we vote online one day, God forbid that Facebook is the identity utility that we use. At the other end of the spectrum, our most trusted logins are typically with our banks, with financial services companies, but they're not portable. You're not logging into the IRS or into Social Security or VA with Citibank or with Chase. You're not logging in to renew your driver's license with USAA or something like that. So portable logins aren't trusted. Trusted logins aren't portable. It's a problem. And we're really passionate about the top right quadrant. How do you make trusted credentials portable so that people can take their verified identity with them? And by the way, we already do this in person. We do it through driver's licenses. You go through one miserable trip to the DMV, and then you have a credential that can easily prove who you are wherever you go, to board an aircraft, check into a hotel, et cetera. Next slide. So on that note, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing with California DMV. Last year, we linked our digital credentials to the California DMV's enrollment process, where every Californian who's applying for a license online, renewing a license, registering to vote, is also creating an ID.me digital credential with multi-factor authentication to protect that account from takeover. And they reached out to us after all the election interference stuff, where driver's license registration is now tied to voter registration in California. And they wanted to protect their voter information from external interference. And so we're very proud to not only be helping with that particular goal, but also to enroll folks into a strong digital identity as they're going through a Real ID process. The second thing that we're doing is we're doing some document pre-screening as part of Homeland Security's Real ID mandate that's going to take effect in October 2020. You have to have a Real ID if you want to board an aircraft. So some examples of operational issues that impact California in particular, 25% of folks will show up at the DMV with insufficient evidence in order to get a Real ID. So for instance, the city of Sunnyvale prints a utility bill where it doesn't actually have your street address on it, just has a street name. So you could be like, okay, I need to bring 2 proofs of residency. A utility bill is an acceptable document. You bring it to the DMV tech and they go, oh, sorry, Sunnyvale utility bills, they don't actually print your actual address, so it's not adequate proof of residency. We'll see you in 3 months. Awful experience for the individual. Awful for the DMV because they've got to credential like 20 million people in the next 17 months. So that's a major, major operational issue that's impacting 1 out of every 4 applicants. So what we're doing is folks can upload their documents even before they get to the DMV and not only get feedback that the document type is appropriate, but we're actually using machine vision to look at the data on the document to let them know this document contains enough information that the tech would approve it, or if you brought this, you'd be rejected, so please get another document. And to do that even before you visit the DMV so you don't have a really frustrating experience. Next slide. We're doing some cool stuff with San Diego, so that's more just a point on interoperability that we're at the state level with California DMV, we're at San Diego, and next slide. We also work very closely with VA, and David and his team are wonderful partners and have largely led a lot of the human-centered design research. A major joint accomplishment working in collaboration with them was to launch a video chat-based identity verification process that allows for any veteran, no matter their demographic background, to get identity proof through a video chat experience that virtualizes what a visit to a government office would be. So there's some pretty emotional stories, like an 81-year-old veteran in Japan who's caring for his wife with Alzheimer's, not in the domestic credit bureaus, doesn't have access to a VA facility. He went through this experience at 11:30 at night over in Japan and was able to get access to his VA services and benefits. I'm a former Ranger, so that stuff hits close to home, and we're really excited about what we call no identity left behind and what VA is referring to as no veteran left behind. A process that opens up digital government to everyone. So with that, I will turn it over to David, who's going to talk about everything that they've done at va.gov.
Yep. Hi, everybody. David Bao. Do we actually have any other veterans that are in the audience? Thank you, and thank you so much for your service. And so yeah, again, I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the Digital Service Team at VA. And for those that aren't too familiar with the United States Digital Service, you can sort of think of us as the tech startup within the federal government, if you will. And so the headquartered team is out of the White House, and then we have separate teams that are embedded into various agencies throughout the federal government. And so at the VA, we have our team that I'm the Deputy Director of. And so one of the major projects that we've been working on for quite some time that we actually launched around Veterans Day of last year was the relaunch of va.gov. And I saw that there's some people trying to take pictures of the slides here. You don't even have to do that because you can just open it on your phone right now, because we wanted to make sure that we could rebrand the front door of the agency to have it actually be veteran-centered and veteran-focused, and not have it be an experience that assumes that veterans and everybody else trying to come to VA knows the nooks and crannies and ins and outs of how the agency is organized, because that's just not the mindset that veterans have when they come to the agency looking to get the benefits and services that they've very well deserved and earned. Instead, through lots of user research, we spoke with over 1,000 veterans to figure out how they wanted to actually interact with VA. And they said, well, when they come to VA, to the website, they're coming with a particular task in mind. And so unblock as many of those roadblocks as possible and just allow them to get to those specific things that they're trying to do and accomplish. And so you'll see in the center of this screenshot of the main website are the top tasks that we've identified. And again, those weren't determined by us talking internally and thinking, oh, this office wants this thing to be in the front, center, et cetera. We got it directly from veterans. And they told us exactly what were the top 20 things that they're actually trying to accomplish. And so naturally, one of the most important pieces of this is actually that tiny little button that's at the top right corner that says sign in. And so I'd actually challenge you to start going through different federal websites, federal agency websites, and count the number of agency websites that have a sign-in button that directly enable the consumers of that agency to actually do something and actually take an action. You won't find too many. And so, we're really proud to have been a part of this, and this is really part of a much broader digital modernization effort that VA has been spearheading, where customer experience is the sort of top most important goal, and making sure that that especially the digital experience that we are providing for our veterans is really matching their expectations at this point. Because to Blake's point, people are now getting so used to using things like social media, things like banking websites and whatnot, where there's now a standard that people just expect. If there's a service that I'm trying to access and use, there should be a certain usability standard. It should understand me. It should know who I am. And so that's why the login experience and identity is so important and such a core piece of this overall solution. Because without that sign-in button and without being able to triangulate across the various credentials that are accepted on this website that I will not go into all the granular details of. I'll be around for a little bit afterward if you want to spitball about that. But to basically be able to help triangulate through, the complexity that government does have, that naturally that people are going to have to be able to navigate through, but allow the digital experience to actually empower them to better access their information, better access their services. So.
Cool.
Yep.
Awesome.
Okay, thanks. So my name is Paul Wight. I'm the Associate Director of Identity Assurance at IRS. And interesting point that David was making about having a sign-in button. So if you go to irs.gov, you will not see one. So I'll just tell you that, although we've talked about it. So, and now I feel a little competition going on here. So I'll take that back. So when you think about the IRS, really, our interest is about protecting the tax ecosystem. So that's filing tax returns, federal tax returns, and the work that we do in identity assurance is to help protect that tax ecosystem. And I will say that if you've watched any of the congressional hearings where IRS executives or our commissioner have spoken before Congress, there's always an emphasis on security and usability. So we default to having more friction, if you will, in our customer experience with our online front door secure access. We branded it as secure access because of the nature of the data that we're protecting. So, I think all of us would prefer that our individual tax records not be easily accessible to anybody who wants to see them, but that very private federal tax information is protected. So I'm not going to sit here and say that it is the most innovative, citizen-centric solution across the federal government. but it is following the current NIST 863-2 standards. I say current because very few of our federal agencies have actually put into place the NIST 863-3. I was very gratified yesterday to see one of the speakers have the 63A journey on one of the slides. That is something that we're looking to implement. And it very well may be, for those of you who sat in the conference, the panel that Mike McAdams, Mike Anthony had earlier this week, one of them made the comment that, you know, what we're looking for in the future is implementing those standards, and it might not be an IRS-built solution. So we may be looking for reliance on a credential service provider. I think what's important for us, though, is that we all know that those NIST standards, they're the right thing to do. Frankly, but they will add more friction for many customers, but they'll also provide opportunities for many customers. And if we go to the next slide, you know, one of the things that we have a few slides here to just talk about the notional future, but it starts with something that IRS did back in May of 2015. You all may recall that we would describe it as a security incident. We had a security incident with our transcript, our online transcript tool, where we had to turn it off for a year while we had USDS come in and help us design the secure access platform with two-factor authentication to protect taxpayers. And as part of that process, we had a real-life case study where knowledge-based authentication, or now known as KBV, the knowledge-based verification, that did not serve us well. And so we stopped using it. So looking forward to IAL2 and AAL2, you've heard about this, probably read about it yourselves. Many of the government folks in the room have. You know, looking for the driver's license or the passport as part of the standard. But in addition to that, we're in IRS very interested in ensuring that it's not a picture of the person, but it's really you when the picture of you is taken with the smartphone through the virtual in-person, or that we know that this is a live person and not just a representation of the person. So the selfie with the liveness is extraordinarily important as part of that process. And then this notion of the cell phone, and we having some insight into, and you all know more about this than I do, and I didn't say this at the beginning, but I come from the business side of IRS. I had 25 years of experience in customer service, and then the last 5 years in being a liaison between our IRS business partners and IT. So, you know, I'm not an IT professional like one of my peers here, but yeah. So the point here is that let's go to the next slide. This notion of device-based identity verification, you know, this is something that is going to be a component that we don't have today, that based on looking at the NIST standards and some of the innovative technology that vendors have, it's something that we'd like to look at in the future. And you know, we do use, as part of our solution now, a mobile network operator confirmation of the the phone. So, has it been ported? How long has the taxpayer, in our case, been associated with that phone, et cetera? So, on the next slide, again, the selfie with biometric matching, just I think key to part of that whole process as we go forward. And the other thing about the NIST standards that I think is going to be very useful for IRS in particular because of the huge demographic that we work with. If you think about, well, how many tax returns are filed? Hundreds of millions of them, and it's each person with income has to file a tax return. So over 130 million tax returns for individuals, and not to mention business tax returns. And then from an authorization standpoint, all of the folks that help us, the IRS, receive those tax returns. So the point of that is that just looking at individuals with respect to this slide, it's a huge, huge demographic. So we're very interested in what the new NIST standards can bring to us with respect to not only virtual in-person identity proofing, but in-person identity proofing, because that's going to be the real value add for our vast and deep demographic groups that file tax returns.
Cool. I will maybe go back to this one so you can see. Oh, there we are.
Perfect.
Cool. So we're going to chat a little bit now as the whole panel. I want to ask, clearly all of you are doing really interesting work with digital identity in government. So I want to ask, what is the biggest challenge that you face? And Paul mentioned the challenge, obviously data security is a big challenge, but at the VA, you're protecting important data too, and you've
Very much so.
managed to walk down this path of digital identity nonetheless. So how are you doing that? What other challenges do you face? And yeah, especially for the government people in the room, like how are you overcoming those challenges?
Yeah, there's definitely no shortage of challenges to be constantly working through at VA. I'd say one of the most interesting challenges that we encounter, to Paul's point about the demographics and the types of people that you have to really design for, is that our veteran population is a very unique demographic. And even within it, there are so many different slices of types of people within the entire span that have a number of pretty unique challenges that we have to account for. And so, spanning from Vietnam era and prior veterans to even the people like some of my friends that literally just came out of service, that are in their 20s that maybe don't have like a full credit history just yet. So there's challenges throughout that entire span. And actually one of the most interesting ones that we've been focusing a lot on are veterans that use assisted devices to be able to access websites and using screen readers. We recently went through a very thorough set of usability testing of our site, in particular the login experience, and trying to make sure that, that everything is in place from an accessibility 508 compliance standpoint. And to be perfectly honest, it was a completely humbling experience to sit on the phone and even just listen in to these usability tests that we were running with veterans and seeing how they were using these devices to help them through the website, and then identifying the number of things that we had to adjust to make their experience easier. And so those types of unique situations are ones that we focus a lot of effort on. And the other side of it that I would say is the sort of the balance that we have to strike between a particular tool that's available on the website or a particular service that we have available. And then to what level do we hold the security for that particular tool? Because it would be easy to just say, okay, everybody that is using anything on va.gov has to go through, and we're similarly also on the current NIST standard of -2. So we could easily say we want to be as secure as possible for everything, and pull the lever really hard and say everybody must be LOA 3 in order to access any of the tools that we have available on the website. Again, going back to the realization of the demographics that we have certain individuals that it's difficult for them to go through a virtual process. And some people do, in fact, have to go into a VA medical facility or another VA office and go through a more in-person version of proofing to be able to get that level of access. And so we have to strike that balance of a particular tool, what level of security do we want to strike with that? And it's something that we have constant conversations with our business folks about, and try to lay it out as plainly as possible to say, here are the trade-offs for this particular tool, and coming to a collaborative solution for that. So.
What about the two of you? I think what I heard that's interesting there is thinking about each individual tool and the necessary security for that tool, instead of thinking about security as a cross-platform reality. How do you see that playing out as well in the work that you're doing, either of you?
Well, I think there's like 2 points, even just to continue on what David was saying. Like, first, you have to map the friction or security to the incentive and the risk of what the user is going through, right? If a veteran's filling out an application and is providing information to the VA, protect it with two-factor authentication, but you don't need to do proofing because they're not pulling information from the VA. There's no risk to the government. So even that, there were some applications where veterans were being asked to proof just to submit information, and we kind of jointly looked at that and said, that doesn't make sense. Like, let's fix that because that feedback is valid. I think some of the challenges, to your point, and specifically with some of the stuff that VA is facing, and then to zoom out for what the industry is facing, is that there was a staff sergeant, a mother who's transferring her GI Bill benefits to her daughter. So she was able to pass, the staff sergeant, the mother was able to pass the self-serve online flow. The daughter is 18 years old. She's about to start college, needs her money for tuition, and needs it like now because they have to get everything into the financial aid office. She's not in financial records yet. She doesn't have a bank account. So she's blocked from the self-serve process, which requires you to pin identity and records. That's where virtual in-person proofing came in. She had video chat, her face, military ID, her state driver's license, and she was able to get through to actually IAL2 through that process and to get access. So that's something that's working well. I think what's more challenging is some of the stuff that Paul was talking about on IAL2 when you start to get to like IDs and biometrics. Now it's like, well, how good are you at almost like a mobile check deposit type of experience of uploading a quality image of an ID? And older users tend to struggle. Biometrics are really challenging for minority groups and folks with darker skin. There's all sorts of articles that kind of delineate some of the challenges with equality around those methods. And the technology industry has a lot of work to do, that if that's the new sort of method of the future as we're moving away from knowledge, how do we solve for that? And so the last point I'd make is that marginalized and like socioeconomic challenge groups have suffered under every modality, right? Like if you're on food stamps or SNAP or on Medicaid, you're more likely to not be in financial records. You're more likely to not have like Wi-Fi at home or to have a spot or a modern device, a smartphone where you could access it. So it's not like this is a new challenge that's being introduced. The relative status quo is equally crappy. But for practitioners and for everyone who's up here with an agency-specific demographics, and then as technologists kind of looking at this across the board, it's a massive, massive challenge to make sure that we have a pathway for access for every demographic group.
Yeah. I would agree with your comments, but also say that these challenges are exciting, and these new NIST guidelines. I say new; they're 2 years old, so not really that new, but not really.
It's not that old in government.
Not really implemented yet either. So in the full scope, so still new to us in government. But these challenges present opportunities, and Blake was speaking to some of those. So in IRS, part of the NIST guidance is you need to form your own risk assessment. So we have what we've coined as a digital identity risk assessment. And we're putting our online web transactions through this process. And what we found is that it's telling us things, some of which are along the lines of what Blake was saying is, how do we best protect the data, but also how do we create less friction for our taxpayers where we can. These challenges are presenting some opportunities too, and while the emphasis on federation is a challenge, and I don't know that it's we have complete solutions around that yet, although talking to some of my peers yesterday in USPS, we have lots of ideas, but you have to bridge from there to real solutions. So, but the M1917 guidance coupled with the 63.3, it is going to present a new way of doing things where perhaps with industry assistance, we can achieve more than what we've achieved in the past.
I think, Paul, you described an interesting situation of balancing the benefits of digital identity against the kind of legitimate security concerns that you have and the kind of data you have to protect, and how the IRS, the status quo, has kind of been go with a little friction to make sure that this stuff is really safe. How do you move the needle on that? And what does it take to move the needle on that, maybe from even a cultural perspective? I mean, a lot of these technologies are out there, but there's culture of friction that maybe has to be addressed as well.
Well, Tasha, what's interesting about that is that so everybody has a mental image of IRS in their mind. and I'll just leave that there. But the point is that by design, IRS is a very conservative organization, and we're not considered extraordinarily innovative in some ways because our job is to administer the tax law. So Congress and the President provide guidance, and we administer. So I think as far as the way people think and sort of ingrained patterns, our challenge is dealing with that conservative foundation, but also a realization that in this area, we need to look at what possibilities could exist. And that's where the Federation and working with CSPs could be a very interesting change, because at the end of the day, IRS is about, as I was saying earlier, tax administration. So, do we need to have our own solution for this challenge? And perhaps the answer is no. But that's something that's being looked at very carefully right now by some of my counterparts in IT in coordination with my staff.
Yeah. Cool.
I just actually want to piggyback off of one thing that you've mentioned about that mindset of how our respective agencies are potentially initially viewed, and the types of opportunities that really opens up for us to be able to help improve from there. So for better or for worse, a lot of the opinions of how quickly things move within VA, whether you're applying for a disability claim, having an appeal about your disability, applying for healthcare and things of that nature. For better or for worse, the status quo of where things have been in terms of the paper versions of those applications, the bar has been set pretty low, to say the least. And so I actually think one of the best ways, in terms of how we've been approaching those problems to help to shift the mindset and the culture of how those types of things are viewed is just honestly by delivering. And so, for example, we recently rolled out new changes to the disability claims process on va.gov, that has a core identity component to it as well, where before those processes could take well over 90 days to go through, because you would fill out the form on paper, you would mail it in, you'd be missing something that you didn't realize that you were missing, a piece of snail mail makes its way back to you saying that you missed one thing, and then you send that back not knowing that there were 2 more pieces of snail mail coming right back at you. And so instead, we sort of flipped that on its head and delivered a newer experience that actually helps you along the way as you're filling out that application and say, oh, if you had this situation, you actually do need to also provide this. Awesome. There's this additional sort of subform that you need to also fill out that, hey, when you're filling out that form, we're going to pre-fill all this other information that you already filled in for the base form to that form over there, so that you're not going to miswrite your information on it. So even things like that to help guide that process forward. And we're already seeing the time that it takes for those types of claims to go through already getting cut in half. And so from our perspective, in terms of how we're really looking at it, it's all about the delivery. It's all about making sure that the changes that we're making, that we're sort of proving ourselves, and using that as a way of resetting the trust level that veterans have with VA.
Yeah, that's awesome. As we talked a little bit about NIST standards, I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I understand 63.-2 is currently being used, but 63.3 is what we're moving to. Mm-hmm. How does the new standard impact the kind of work that you're doing in government? What opportunities does it open up, or challenges does it present as you move to that new standard?
So from VA perspective, at least, like I mentioned, we're not currently up to the -3 standard yet, but we've been keeping a very, very close eye on it. And honestly, the core of it that we've been focusing on is the split between going from just strict LOA levels to actually having the identity side of it versus the authenticator side of it, IAL versus AAL. From a pure technical perspective, which is obviously how I will always start to look at things, it actually makes things a lot clearer, because there's so many situations where we're going through today, and the matrices that we build out of the types of credentials that we're handling, and trying to figure out, well, this is actually falling under this LOA level right now. Therefore, and it dovetails into the discussions I was talking about prior, and how we have to balance, the utility of the tools that we have against the security that we're putting against it. So seeing the split of the two, where it might seem like it would become more of an issue when we're trying to build things, in a way will actually make things a lot more straightforward. To say, well, these particular tools, or this class of tool that we have available, needs to have 2-factor, therefore it must be a AAL2. But then, within that, then we can be a little bit more granular to say which ones require a particular level of, identity verification. And so we're actually very excited about the new standard. The challenges naturally have to do with the specific changes that we would be introducing to veterans, and to those earlier points about the types of demographics that we serve and the potential issues that we may run into. Again, no shortage of challenges and things to work out, but definitely very excited to move in that direction.
Yeah, I think just to carry on to that point, NIST sort of giveth and NIST taketh away. It's a good catalyst to move the market in the right direction. What's interesting about the -3 standards is that they're much more modular. So they separated out identity proofing, the process of verifying you are who you're claiming to be, from tokens and authenticators, and how you protect an account from takeover. And that guidance does make it much more clear to understand, okay, if somebody submitted PII or PHI on a document, I need AAL2, strong tokens. I might not need to verify who they are. And so the application of a risk assessment to the actual controls that you have in place. But it's interesting that there's still a lot left up to the agency's discretion to determine what's right. Because even at identity assurance level 2, liveness, what Paul was talking about, is not mandatory. It's a should, it's not a shall. So you could do it, what's required is matching. Matching is very easily defeated. I could go find a picture of your face from FedScoop. If I had your wallet and your ID, all of a sudden I'm Tasha, right? Like that's an image of you. It's just going to match the photo on your legitimate government ID. Liveness is a different level where there's technologies that can defeat 3D video fakes, that can defeat somebody wearing a mask. And NIST has a test called SOFA, S-O-F-A, level B, for anti-spoofing that can defeat those attacks. So even though it's not required even at IAL2, if you have a high-risk transaction where maybe you're about to make a disbursement to a taxpayer in excess of $10,000, that risk profile, that transaction dramatically outweighs most of what VA is doing, although VA also will have applications around entitlement benefits and direct deposit that might also need that level of trust. So I think they laid out a pretty good roadmap. There's still room for improvement because a lot of the things that even industry is struggling to measure, like behavioral authentication, like the way that you type, the way that you walk, what's known as like heuristics. That's not really talked about a lot in NIST because industry's kind of figuring it out, and if NIST can't measure it, they can't write standards around it. But I think it's a dramatic step in the right direction, and it's going to force practitioners to really kind of figure things out, and NIST has given them a good framework to configure, those different capabilities against the user journey. So,
yeah. So, not to repeat these great comments, what I would say is that we're eager to implement the new standards, and there are some challenges that are, frankly, some of them are pocketbook because of the friction involved with what Blake has been talking about, and all of us with respect to the whole identity verification process in the IAL regime. For federal government and for other industry groups that adopt these standards, it's going to be more expensive than it is today. So because of that, I think you all know that the federal government has a variety of challenges with respect to individual agencies and their funding. So that is just a reality of the situation, especially when you talk about the scale of the number of identities that we're talking about. It's potentially tens of millions, hundreds of millions. So that is one of the realities that we're going to have to work through and figure out. And the federated, the 63C guidelines, and is there an opportunity there to, through federation, to reduce costs? We'll have to see how that plays out in reality. But again, there are great opportunities here for reaching more taxpayers in IRS's language than we do today. And that is something that, frankly, is very, very important, but it's going to take us some time to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. I have more questions, but I want to pause for a second because we have 6 minutes left. Question in the audience. Yes.
So for the government guys, have you seen, since you started to invest in some of these digital identity solutions, have you seen a reduction in fraud that you can put a number to? Kind of question one. And question two is, how do you make the determination between GOTS versus COTS when you're doing building out your identity?
David, so on the fraud question, we have, when we stood up our secure access platform 3 years ago, one of the components of that solution was to have a very robust cyber fraud analytics and monitoring team. So we're continuously looking at near real-time and offline analytics in order to have a sense for what is the nature of the fraud. And so we have a very robust process to ensure that we're looking at that all the time. And when we have suspicious activity that rises to the level of concern, that we have the usual suspects that gather together to look at what's happening to protect our taxpayers. You know, on the second question, I'm not really going to speak to that very much because I would stray out of my business role. But I think that right now we have, for the most part, an IRS-built solution that has COTS products integrated into it. That will probably be, I don't know if we'll have that in the future. We may have more of COTS products through a CSP.
So it's actually pretty interesting that you bring that up because there's two very interesting examples that we've encountered recently where one of them had to do with the healthcare applications that get submitted online, where actually the business side thought that there was a number of applications that were being submitted that were attempted to be fraudulent. And so as we initially started to look at that tool and that sort of lens, we dug into it deeper. And then what we actually figured out was it wasn't fraudulent submissions of healthcare applications. It was actually just veterans that didn't even know if they had healthcare that were trying to apply again because they just didn't know. And so, you know, it was interesting to be flagged in that way, and then, you know, in using human-centered design to kind of approach it and figure out that there is another problem altogether that we were able to apply an identity-based solution towards to help out with a lot, to do something as simple as actually show the healthcare status of a veteran on their personalized page. So there's that angle of it. The other angle that's referring to, you know, actual fraud that happens at VA. And so the majority of the tools that we have so far put on the new va.gov haven't been of that variety yet, but we are actually looking to help migrate an existing tool that is sort of fraud with fraud today to be hosted and served through the website. And in that one, we're taking a very close look at how we can ensure that the proper identity pieces are put in place to ensure that we're doing everything that we can to prevent fraud from happening, at the same time making sure that we're providing our business analysts who actually have a very sophisticated process that they go through to try to detect this type of fraud that happens, to be able to provide them with all the technological things that they need to continue to assess that issue over time. So.
Yes, one quick question.
I had a question about assisted identity proofing, or especially for you in terms of we're having issues identity proofing. You mentioned going in person. Do you consider using trusted referee, and if so, how?
Yeah. So the question is about for those that are having difficulty with completing their identity proofing remotely and how we've approached that problem. To your point, we've basically trying to take every possible angle to help address it. And so naturally the in-person approach to be able to have somebody go into a medical facility and have the proofing process that they go through there actually be directly tied to their digital identity so that they can be sort of upgraded in that angle. In addition, we have also been looking at and implementing trusted referees as well, so that if you encounter an issue in the middle of the flow, that you can actually, at that point, either schedule an appointment to be able to go through the virtual in-person proofing process, or actually do so immediately if it's available. So we're definitely trying to take all angles at it. And what I mentioned before, also just from a general accessibility standpoint, just make sure that every part of that process, that it's not just the tech-savvy veterans that can figure it all out, but all of our veterans that we wish to serve.
Great. Well, I think they're going to kick us off stage now. So thank you all for coming, and big thank you to my panel for sharing everything this morning.
Great job.